Today on Flashpoints, the Keystone pipeline and the safety pig that was muzzled so it couldn't squeal. We'll be joined by Greg Palast and the pig. No, we won't have the pig, but we'll have Greg. Also, Flashpoint special correspondent Randy Credico is subpoenaed to appear before the House Russiagate Committee. Imagine that. And more threats and tests as the U.S. continues its face-off with North Korea. They test a missile that could... They're saying, that's what folks are saying, that it could slam into the continental U.S. We'll see what that's all about. I'm Dennis Bernstein. All this straight ahead on Flashpoints. Stay tuned. Getting a little breathless there with all the breaking news. But, just before airtime, our special correspondent, Randy Credico, received a subpoena to appear before the House Select Committee on Intelligence. I don't know how intelligent the committee is, but it is turning into a McCarthyite op. We'll hear more about that later on, but we are delighted to be joined by Greg Palast. The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, the movie, brand newly reconstituted. We're going to be talking about that in a week or so. But Greg has been on a special investigation that had to do with the Keystone pipeline explosion. Greg, we're going to play a piece that you did, but let's talk a little bit about this pig here. What the hell is going on with the pig? Did they use pigs to sort of check the safety of pipelines?
Yeah, they do. In fact, the PR man for the Keystone pipeline, a guy named Mark Cooper, he said to his own and everyone's astonishment, he says, this shouldn't have happened, this blowout at the pipeline, because we put actual pigs in the pipeline. Well, he's thinking of like these big, some porkers or maybe oil company executives. But actually a pig, because the engineer told him there's pigs in the pipeline. A pig is a pipeline inspection gauge, PIG. And these are robots that go through the pipelines with the oil. By the way, they say that there's thousands of jobs in the Keystone pipeline. The current Keystone pipeline, which covers most of America, is run by only 50 people and a bunch of pigs, these robots. They're 50 people because they basically watch, you have a whole team 24/7 watching these robots go through the pipe. They have little feelers. They can feel any bit of corrosion, any wrong weld, any problem whatsoever. And the pig is monitoring every inch of that pipe. So there shouldn't be, he's right, there should not be a crack like a burst that we just had. There should not be bursts in any pipelines that now use these, what they call smart pigs. And this is very important. If you're in the San Bruno area and you know someone who was victimized by that gas explosion, listen up to this story. So why did the pigs not warn of this impending burst? They're so sensitive that, bursts don't just suddenly happen.
Now, how bad was the burst? What do you mean burst?
A burst, there were at least 250,000 gallons of oil burst out of the Keystone pipeline.
Big burst.
This is the pipeline they said, don't worry about. It's going through our waterways. Well, now it's another burst, 250,000 gallons, their biggest yet. And they're right. It shouldn't, if the pigs, if they find any little problem, which will lead to such a burst, is that the computer screens, you see red on the computer screens. It's really made, it's kind of supposed to be idiot-proof. So why didn't the pig squeal when it went through the pipeline? The answer is that the pig it's a robot, and it was technologically muzzled. How do they do that? The pigs are benign. They're just sending out, waves of billions of data points. You need sophisticated software to read it, interpret it, and say, oops, there's a problem in, near the North Dakota border right there with corrosion that could burst. There's a change in pressure. There's whatever it is. It should have had it, and they're correct. So what we have found out, and this is ugly, and this is frightening, and this is terrible, Dennis, 3 whistleblowers confirmed to me that as an industry practice, and in particular companies that provide this software, that they deliberately turn down the pig's squeal. That is, electronically, they make the pigs appear to be less sensitive than they should be. And the sensitivity of these robots for warning is set by law, by regulation. You can't just, fake it. there are regulations as to when that pig squeals, and they've been turned down. And that's why we're having these so-called inexplicable explosions. And the most obvious one that was affected here was in San Bruno. Because,
let me guess, Greg, that shall we say, pigging out, not using the pig, has something to do with saving money.
Oh, yes. Follow the money, Dennis. I knew you'd get there. You can't bribe a pig, but you can certainly threaten workers who don't go along. Why would they want to turn down their robots so that they don't squeal? Why wouldn't they want the warning? The answer is money, money. Every time that pig squeals and the screen goes red, you've got to dig up the pipe. You've got to stop the flow of oil or natural gas. You've got to stop that flow. You've got to reroute the pipe. You've got to replace the pipe. It's frankly cheaper and easier to simply replace a pipe which is already burst. Because if every time the pig found a problem, you started replacing pipes around the U.S., that would cost the pipeline industry billions, and that's with a B, billions of dollars more per year. So it's better to kind of take the chance that they'll fail. And that it's an ugly truth. And I got to tell you, Dennis, I first did an investigation of pipeline explosions. Before I was a journalist, I ran 2 pipeline explosion investigations for the Attorney General of Illinois. 18 people in Chicago were blown up. And I saw that the company knew exactly where their pipes could possibly blow. They could pinpoint them. You could almost buy the coffins in advance. It was ugly, but they paid off the victims' families like $3-4 million each. There were 18 people killed, and it's cheaper than replacing miles of pipe, especially in urban areas like Chicago or San Bruno. This is a deadly problem. So when these guys, like the Koch brothers and others, tell you that the Keystone pipeline or any pipeline is safe because they've got these robots so they can't miss, they're lying because they know that they're muzzled.
Well, let's, now that you really laid it out nicely, let's listen to the piece. You prepared a piece for Tom Hartman. Is it okay if we give a listen to that? So sort of like really sort of lays it out now that people understand what we're talking about. Let's listen to that piece that Greg prepared on all of this. Listen to this.
Last Thursday, the Keystone pipeline burst open and dumped over 200,000 gallons of crude onto the Dakota prairie. Was the problem caused by a pig? This is Greg Palast reporting. According to the owner of the pipe, TransCanada, big spills should never happen because the company continuously monitors the pipe.
At TransCanada, we understand just how important it is to be prepared. We implement 24/7 monitoring from our centralized oil control center 365 days a year.
How do they monitor the pipe? They use a PIG, P-I-G, a pipeline inspection gauge.
The Smart Pig is an inline inspection device that is inserted into the pipeline. The oil or natural gas pushes it along the length of the pipe without disrupting the flow. A Smart Pig can detect minute imperfections in the pipe, allowing us to assess its condition without having to excavate. This information is analyzed by TransCanada pipe integrity experts and used to ensure continued safety of the pipe.
Pipeline should never burst nor explode. The pigs should pick up the minor problems that signal a big crack coming.
If our highly trained staff identifies even a small irregularity, they can shut down the flow of oil immediately.
In fact, right after the explosion, TransCanada issued a statement expressing its surprise at the big break. According to company spokesman Mark Cooper, quote, "We send actual pigs through our pipeline. They're gauges that note any kind of sensitive areas." So what happened? Why didn't the pigs squeal? Well, according to whistleblowers, the pigs are honest, but the software is not. Are we getting honest data from these pigs?
We're getting honest data from the pigs. What we're not getting necessarily would be honest interpretation of the pig data.
This man, once in charge of writing the software interpreting the pig's data, is in shadow, his voice disguised for a good reason.
I've been threatened by my former client that I worked on the software for. I know that the oil and gas industry has a lot more time and resources and money than I do. And a person can be made silent, can be made bankrupt by this power that they hold.
The software effectively turns down the warning signal. The software makes the pigs less sensitive to danger than required by government regulations.
The regulations were not programmed entirely correct in this piece of software.
When you say there's errors in the software, did those errors end up making the pipes safer or less safe?
It ends up making the pipes less safe. It ends up telling the pipeline operator, the people who use the software, it feeds them incorrect information about the state of their pipeline. So, in the worst example, you could have a pipeline that has corrosion that goes into an urban area where there are many people. They explode.
And that's just what happened in Northern California when a pipeline exploded and killed 8. When the software specialists fixed the errors, they were told to leave the errors in place deliberately.
My team corrected it. I was part of a team that corrected the error. The consequence of fixing the software would be that that pipeline operator would need to apply fixes to a greater number of pipeline segments. They would have to do more reroutes, which are expensive.
Very expensive. Billions of dollars expensive to dig up the pipe and replace it. It's a lot cheaper to pay for the occasional spill, explosion, and death. 2 other industry insiders corroborated our whistleblower, but were too afraid to get on camera, even in shadow.
Any person that speaks out against pipeline companies puts a lot at risk.
This is Greg Palast reporting.
And Greg Palast joins us on Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. Greg, the story is troubling because this is just one explosion, one part of the pipeline. But if this is policy, we can expect a bunch more explosions, and all this crap about special care they're taking now and monitoring, and there's never a leak, and all this stuff is just set aside by the corporate bottom line. If it costs too much, we'd rather pay after the fact than before.
Yeah, there's no question. And the Keystone's already lying. They said, because they already said it's only 200,000 gallons of oil. But that's what's coming up to the surface. The break was below. But I want to and you have to understand, this is industry endemic. I know that this software, for example, is being used on the Alaska pipeline. The software, which is wrong, which is dangerous, okay? And, and in San Bruno, one thing, and this is why I really am glad I'm speaking to the Northern California audience, because I do know that in the case of San Bruno, and again, I've done these investigations for government. I was looking at the San Bruno case. The federal government believes that maybe they just didn't set the pigs' sensitivity to make it even more sensitive, that the regulations were not strong enough. And that's why San Bruno exploded, because the pig had just gone through a couple of weeks before. That shouldn't have happened if the pig were squealing as it should, But what the feds do not understand is the problem is not in their regulations. The problem is in the millions of lines of software. They have to accept these companies' honesty. Millions of lines of software, which in fact didn't adhere to the legal standards. And this is, and especially and by the way, this whistleblower came to me right after the San Bruno explosion. He did not want to be on camera, even in shadow. I mean, it's very dangerous to deal with this industry as a whistleblower. You get ruined. And, but after he saw the deaths in San Bruno, he said, to him, this went from a technical dispute with a client to something that kills people, and he had to come forward. So with San Bruno, the deaths there, he said he had to speak out.
All right, we're going to watch that story very closely. We're speaking with Greg Palast, the best democracy money can buy. Greg, I want to talk to you as we speak. The discussion continues. It's gone from the House to the Senate in terms of this so-called tax reform bill. General thoughts. You follow these things very closely, and yes, you have some specifics on particular aspects of the story. What would you like to offer on this?
Well, I want to talk to you about another pig who didn't squeal. Donald Trump had said that when he was running for president, big headlines in the New York Times, that he was adopting Bernie Sanders' position that they should close the biggest loophole for Wall Street speculators. It's called carried interest, and it costs the U.S. Treasury for this 10-month budget period. It's going to cost the U.S. Treasury $170 billion that will go to a few speculators. The number one user, by the way, of this tax loophole in America, who personally gains at least $1 billion in his pocket from it, is Robert Mercer, the number one donor to Donald Trump. The head of his advisory committee and Steve Mnuchin's partner, JP the Foreclosure King, personally saved over $1 billion using this carried interest loophole. Paul the Vulture Singer, who we've talked about before, he's another guy who has his snout in the carried interest trough. So Trump made a big deal. He is going to end this Wall Street loophole. There's no economic value to it to the country. And he said, and I quote, "It's so unfair. It's so unfair." And yet in this tax bill, so unfair, it's still there. And no one has called him out. And unfortunately, you say, well, what about the Democrats? Why don't they? That's $170 billion. That could save, for example, the California local tax deduction. So why don't the Democrats bring it up? Once again, because they've got their Wall Street speculators. Mercer's partner, John Simon, is the other big user of this tax loophole, and he's one of Hillary's top donors. So we got the problem that there's two parties who have their pigs in the carried interest loophole trough, $170 billion, and no one's done anything. And I noticed that the financial press, everyone is pretty much silent. Like, what happened to this promise of Donald Trump? We bring it up in our film, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. Before the election, I knew this was going to happen because Trump made the big statement, and right after he made it, suddenly these billionaires are backing him. And say, well, why are billionaires backing him if he's going to slap $170 billion tax on them? The answer is so they can get him off it and redirect him. And they did. Wow.
And this is in the bill now, as it came out of the House.
What it is what it isn't. In other words, it's not in the bill. After this big deal, it's the number one tax savings he could make, $170 billion. And yet they are, you have a House proposal that would raise taxes on teachers. They wouldn't let you. You're not allowed to take off crayons that you buy for your kindergarten classes anymore. Crazy stuff like that, all for the purpose of paying off these loopholes for billionaires. And yet here's this big giant loophole that Donald Trump made a big deal about. He's in a dozen speeches complaining about this tax loophole for Wall Street. And by the way, I would note it's one of the only loopholes for rich guys he doesn't use. It's purely for the Wall Street speculators. There's no value in it. It doesn't encourage investment. It encourages the worst speculation, and his biggest donors are the biggest abusers, and he won't touch it. So what I wanted to do, and I'm glad you gave me the platform, is to point out, everyone's talking about what the tax bill does. And I think it's very important to discuss what the tax bill doesn't. Because if you're going to reform the tax law, you start with a billionaire's loophole, $170 billion for carried interest. By the way, this is how Romney was able to protect most of his money from being taxed. And by the way, Obama promised in that election in 2012 that he was going to close that loophole.
Yeah,
he got in and never proposed closing the loophole once he got in.
But Penny Pritzker became Secretary of Commerce.
So it's a two-party party.
Yeah, it's a two-party party. All right, Greg, we're going to leave it there. We thank you for the very good information. As always, a pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to the next horrible visit. Thanks for joining us on
and listen to Randy. Bye.
All right, take it easy. You're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio.